Adele, I've only just turned the camera on and I don't recognise someone. Subscribe for spooky shit. Hello, spooklets. Oh, welcome back to the... Hello. Please subscribe. Today, we're delving into Lincoln Castle. Lincoln Castle is, believe it or not, in Lincoln, and it is my city. Not mine, like, I'm not the mayor of it. No, the mayor doesn't even own it. You know what I mean? I've lived here my whole life. I live in Lincoln. That was the floorboard, not my ass. But Lincoln Castle has stories of its very own.
Hauntings.
And we're going to read them today, but first off, we're going to read the history on the place. Let me just get things up. I'm not prepared for this video whatsoever. Bear with. So, we're on lincolncastle.com. Our history. Built almost 1,000 years ago by William the Conqueror, Lincoln Castle has witnessed some of the most dramatic events in English history. It is true. After William the Conqueror's victory at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, he faced continuing resistance and ordered the construction of a castle at Lincoln as part of his strategy to control the rebellious north of the kingdom. The castle's commanding position not only afforded far-reaching views, it also served as a reminder to the local population that the Normans were in charge. Centuries earlier, the Roman invaders had built their legionary... There she goes again. Fortress on this hilltop. In 1068, the Normans constructed their Motte and Bailey castle here, reusing the remaining stone walls of the later Roman city, Lindum Colonia. The castle walls were built in stone in the late 11th century, replacing the temporary wooden palisade, Lucy Tower, a permanent stone shell. Keep replaced the first wooden keep on the earth mound. Did I even read that right? The castle walls were built in stone in the late 11th century, replacing the temporary wooden palisade. Lucy Tower, a permanent stone shell keep, replaced the first wooden keep on the earth mound. No, it just sounds weird. Okay, battles and sieges. Lincoln Castle bears the scars of the bloody battles fought by opposing forces who sought control of this strategically important stronghold. In 1141, while King Stephen was occupied in a war with his cousin Matilda over the English crown, he fought to wrest back control of the castle after it had been claimed by Ranulph, Earl of Chester. During the battle, which came to be known as the Joust of Lincoln, Stephen was captured outside the castle and taken to Matilda as a prize and imprisoned. Only when Matilda's half-brother was captured 7 months later and exchanged for Stephen was the king restored to the throne. 50 years later, under the leadership of Lady Nicola de la Haye, the castle withstood a 40-day siege by Richard First's Chancellor. I try and be professional, alright, and it just doesn't work. Longchamps when he demanded the loyalty of supporters of the king's younger brother, Prince John. Nicola, in her own right as constable, defended the castle again in 1217 during a civil war that followed King John's refusal to honour Magna Carta in 1215. During the hostilities, rebel barons allied themselves with Prince Louis of France and seized control of swatches of England, including the city of Lincoln. Swathes. Why did I say swatches? Oh my days. I am so sorry. But the castle, a royalist stronghold, held out against the French forces and rebel barons under its formidable constable. This was of national significance and turned the tide of French invasion. If the royalists had lost, England could have come under French rule. Lincoln Castle was besieged for the final time in 1644, during the English Civil War, when the royalists holding it were overwhelmed by a mightier parliamentarian force. Royal visitors. King Henry II visited Lincoln several times in the late 12th century. Archaeologists have discovered an astonishing range of bird, fish and animal bones, from plover, lapwing and swan to conger eel, oyster and venison, in a medieval rubbish pit, perhaps the remains of a lavish feast held in his honour. King John spent several days at Lincoln in September 1216, shortly before he lost his jewels and baggage in the incoming tide of the Wash. Within 2 weeks of his visit, he died of dysentery at Newark Castle. Over 300 years later, in August 1541, King Henry VIII, accompanied by his young Queen Catherine Howard, rode at afternoon to the castle and did view it and the city. as part of his royal progress to York. Okay, so the Magna Carta, the charter sent to Lincoln in 1215, was read out at the Sheriff's Court in Lincoln Castle before being placed in the cathedral treasury for safekeeping. Retained in Lincoln ever since, it is one of only 4 surviving originals. Now, Lincoln Castle I have been to numerous amounts of times because it's just something that I can do in my city, and I do love history. I love the history of Lincoln. We will talk more of the history of Lincoln. My city is quite interesting and quite haunted as well. But I have seen the Magna Carta so many times, and it's behind this glass with lights on it. It's just, yeah, it's amazing to look at this piece of history. Okay, Cobb Hall. Cobb Hall defended the castle's northeast corner from the 13th century onwards. The tower's vaulted ceilings also suggest that Cobb Hall might have been used as a chapel as well as a dungeon. Between 1817 and 1859, executions by hanging took place on the roof. Vast crowds gathered below the castle walls to watch each of the 38 condemned prisoners and meet their fate on the wooden gallows. There is a pub outside the castle walls called the Strugglers Inn, named for that, and apparently where that pub is and the car park area is where people would go for family picnics to watch the hangings. There is so many investigations I could do in Lincoln, and there is some on the channel, and I do need to do more. I would love to do Lincoln Castle though, 100%. You wait till we get onto the hauntings. Lucy Tower, originally 1 story higher, enclosed the constable of the castle's living quarters, which were constructed in timber. The tower's east and a west wing have not survived. In the early 19th century, the tower became a burial ground. Graves of prisoners who were hanged at the castle still lie within. The Observatory Tower. The Observatory Tower's turret, added in the early 19th century, sits atop the original medieval stonework. The purpose of the turret is not known, but it may have gained its name from the time John Merriweather was a gaol-keeper of the Georgian Gaol between 1799 and 1830. His hobby was astronomy and gazing at the stars through his telescope. During the Second World War, civil defence volunteers equipped with binoculars and just a tin hat for protection kept a lookout from the roof for enemy aircraft in the skies above Lincolnshire. The Castle Dungeons. William Chaldwell, a royalist prisoner held in 1643 during the English Civil War, was thrown into a stinking witch hole, a reference to the earlier incarceration of the so-called Belvoir witches. They were hanged in 1619, accused of causing the death of the Duke of Rutland's young son. In the 18th century, the gaol at Lincoln Castle, like others at this time, was run as a private business. Prisoners had to pay for their keep, and unscrupulous gaolers charged excessive fees for food and bedding. Prisoners were locked up together in filthy, crumbling dungeons and buildings without fresh water or sanitation. There are no traces now of the earlier prisons within the castle walls. To prison cell. The red brick Georgian gaol was built in 1788 to hold both felons and debtors. The debtors were treated more leniently and housed in the front range, still standing. The prison governor also lived there in an apartment with his family. In 1848, a national prison building scheme saw the demolition of the felons' wing and the construction of new Victorian prison wing. This became a holding centre for short-term male, female and child prisoners awaiting trial at the courthouse, and convicts pending removal elsewhere to serve their sentence. The debtors continued to be held in the Georgian Gaol building. The Victorian prison. It was designed to implement the separate system, a regime intended to keep prisoners separate from the corrupting influence of their fellow inmates and bring about their moral reform. Separate cells were provided with a sink, toilet and hammock so that there were no need for prisoners to leave them except for exercise and fresh air in the airing yards, and the daily chapel service led by the prison's chaplain, the Reverend Henry Richer. In the event, the separate system was never fully implemented due to initial overcrowding, a fever which swept through the prison and ultimately the reluctance of the magistrates. By 1878, expensive running costs and declining prisoner numbers led to the prison's closure just 30 years after it opened. Seat of Justice. Courts have been held at Lincoln Castle since it was first built. Back then, the sheriff, who was William the Conqueror's right-hand man in Lincolnshire, presided over the castle's shire court. Today, the Gothic Revival Courthouse, built in 1826 for the Lincolnshire Assizes, is still a working building where criminal trials are heard by Lincoln Crown Court. Lincoln Castle revealed. From 2010 to 2015, Lincoln Castle underwent a major £22 million restoration project with funding from Heritage Lottery funding, Lincolnshire County Council, European Regional Development Fund, David Ross Foundation and private donations. The project involved the restoration of the castle curtain wall and creation of new 360-degree medieval wall walk atop the castle's ancient ramparts, restoration and reinterpretation of the Victorian prison, and the building of a new vault to house Magna Carta and Charter of the Forest with a widescreen cinema for showing films about the documents. So, Lincoln Castle, if you're ever in Lincoln, go to Lincoln Castle. I 100% recommend. So you can go into the grounds of the castle in the Bailey walls of the castle. One thing I'm going to say actually, and it's stuck with me for a very long time, I went to the castle once and for a change I did the tour. The tour was free for some reason on this day, so I thought, you know, I'd love to learn a little bit more of the history. One thing that really stood out to me was, right, with a motte on Bailey Castle, the motte is normally in the middle of the Bailey walls. Well, Lincoln Castle's motte is at the edge in with the wall, and that's because there is a big drop the other side, the view, because Lincoln Castle is uphill. So obviously they could see perfectly over there. The Bailey is the walls of the castle, right? And this stuck with me and it fascinates me so much. So when prisoners went out on exercise, they were allowed to go outside but stay within the walls, the Bailey walls, and that term is still used today, out on bail. It really interested me and fascinated me, but yeah, anyway. Okay, we're now going to move on to hauntings. Okay, so we're going to look at the chapel. The chapel is... I've heard a lot of ghost stories in the chapel, so we're just going to look at the chapel and see what I found. So from 1787 to 1878, the castle acted as Lincoln's prison, and its Victorian prison chapel is still acknowledged as being haunted. Its coffin-like pews were intended to remind prisoners of the fate awaiting them. Several people have encountered an unseen entity lurking in the tiny tiered pews and complain of feeling a cold breeze as an invisible something brushes slowly by them. Now, the chapel is a favourite bit of mine. I know it sounds crazy, but when I go in, I feel an energy shift in there. Like, you know, when you just feel like there's an atmosphere, all right? I am not a medium, I'm not a psychic, but if you listen to your senses, you can sense things, and because I do paranormal investigations, I think I've learnt things as I go along. I don't know, but when I go in the chapel, I feel this, like, I'm going to say energy change. It just sort of, it's quite thick in there for me, and every time I go in it happens. And I stand at the top. I've took so many photos at the top because people have took so many photos of that. Well, so many people have took photos of that and they think they've caught figures within the pews. They do have dummies in them, so that when you stood up there you can see all these dummies. You can go in them and sit in them, which is really creepy. I would love to investigate in the chapel. I don't think it will ever happen unless I become massively big on YouTube, because obviously it's channels that are bigger that tend to get to do opportunities like that. I would absolutely love to investigate the chapel. I would also like to investigate the prison, but we'll get onto the prison in a moment. But the chapel, for me, does feel like there's an energy in there, and it's not nice, understandably, but yeah, it's really creepy in there. So we're now going to move on to ghost stories of the Victorian prison. Again, the Victorian prison, absolutely love that as well. There is so much you can do at Lincoln Castle. You can visit the prison, which is literally fully functional, if that makes sense. Like, it's all there. It's not a castle ruins, Lincoln Castle. It is you can enter everything. The only thing that isn't open to the public is Dungeons Underground. Okay, so ghost stories. Some visitors have reported seeing a former matron haunting one of the rooms, rushing to aid a female prisoner who had unalived themselves to avoid a public execution. Others have seen a different female spirit dressed in black walking up and down the steps to the gallows. Some report hearing or seeing cell doors clanging shut and disembodied screams coming from the men's wing of the prison, despite it being completely empty since 1878. When I say fully functional, like there aren't prisoners in there, but it's fully functional. Does that make sense? Everything's there in working order, basically. The most disturbing rumours are the sounds of sobbing and growling coming from the graveyard where prisoners who had died without family or friends claim their bodies were buried. Again, the prison, I love going in there. I love history. The thing is with me, I love walking where people once walked, if that makes sense. I'm obsessed with the past. I'm obsessed with history. And I'm obsessed with the paranormal. I'm obsessed. So walking through the prison, I tend to like lose myself and just imagine, if that makes sense. I'm sure a lot of you do things like that as well. Please tell me I'm not the only one. So moving on to this, I've often thought staff must, it's staff, they're always there, they must see something more than visitors do, or hear something at least. So it says, whilst on duty, staff have reported unexplained noises within the castle and there have been a number of sightings outside. A young mother is often spotted on the stairs of the Victorian prison, whilst the graveyard, gallows and observatory tower have also been the source of strange sounds and dark shadows. One of the most common sightings, though, at the castle is the ghost of a lone rider and his horse. I have heard this story before. Dating back to the time of the first hangings at Lincoln, it is believed that the ghost was the friend of a local lord who was wrongfully sentenced to death. The rider was sent with a pardon from the king to save his friend, but failed to reach the court in time. His ghost continues to charge the castle today, trying to finish the journey he never managed to complete. So, I have heard that story before, but I've also heard that you can apparently hear him basically stood at the gate saying, "Let me in." It's not them words. He just says something different, but I can't remember what it is. So Lincoln Castle not only is a beautiful castle to visit, I'm not even joking. Absolutely love that castle. You can do the entire wall walk. I can remember when I was younger, you could only go so far. You could go quite far around, but then you had to turn around and come back because the wall had broke, but they've reconstructed it so you can get all the way around now. And then there's the observatory tower as well. There is so much history, and the thing is, when there is so much history in places, they are the places that you ideally want to try and do a paranormal investigation. I mean, it's old. People have been and gone, died there. So many people. And castles, a lot of people died at castles, whether it's in the dungeons or what. Battle. A lot of people died, or not even that, there will be a lot of residual energy like just soaked into the walls there. I want to do an investigation at Lincoln Castle. It is walking distance from my house, please. But yeah, it's I think Lincoln Castle is a goal of mine to go investigating. Maybe one day. If I do, I'll cry. If I ever get to investigate a Lincoln Castle, I will cry, but until then I'm just going to have to keep hoping and wishing. Like I said, Lincoln is quite known for its hauntings, and I would like to tell you more of the stories. It's quite gory. Like the city I live in. I live uphill Lincoln. You've got uphill and downhill. Uphill is the most historic part, so I literally live right near the cathedral and the castle. It's one of them things where if I've been for a walk during the night, I mean an evening walk or something, and I go up that end and walk around the castle like walls, like on the outside obviously, and around the cathedral, and I often look and I think, oh, we take this for granted. Like, who gets to walk around the cathedral? Like, do you know what I mean? Just walking distance from the house to just walk around a cathedral on just a normal evening stroll. It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful, and we've still got all original cobblestone Roman roads, and yeah, I'll show you a bit more of Lincoln upcoming on the channel, I think, because the history is amazing. It really, really is. But thank you so much for joining me tonight, guys. You know I love your company. Also, I don't know if I did at the beginning of the video, but thank you to the channel members. You guys are awesome. You're still here that I don't recognise. Have you hit subscribe yet? And I'm going to go and get in touch with Lincoln Castle. They might let me nod. Maybe one day. But yeah, I'm going to go. Thank you for joining me, guys. And I will see you all in the next video. But until then, sleep tight.